Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone out to our 2011 Sealaska Heritage Institute Native American Heritage Month lecture series. It's a pleasure to have everyone who is here in attendance today and those who may watch in the future via the web. I first, of course, need to thank our sponsors, the Sealaska Heritage Institute and the Sealaska Corporation, as well as our one of our main sponsors, MRV Architects, and our friends of the lecture series, the McDowell Group and Kathy Ruddy, who've contributed generously to support this lecture series. Today it's our pleasure to hear from Dr. and Professor Thomas Thornton. Professor Thornton is the head of the school, I better get this correct, he is with the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. He is the director for the Masters in Science in Environmental Change and Management. He is a widely published academic and has done a great deal of research on the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And it's our pleasure to hear from him today. And I'll turn the time over to Dr. Thornton.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It's my understanding I have to hold this. Is it on? Okay, so I have to hold this, and I'm also wired, and there's another microphone. So I've never been so well broadcast. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today, and this is an especially appropriate place for me to talk about the project that I'm involved with now with Sealaska Heritage Institute and also University of Oregon State University and Portland State University, where I was before I moved to Oxford. And I'm going to talk about a research project that's in process, and I will not be able to present a lot of formal results, but I will try to focus on some of the conceptual issues that have arisen, which I think are interesting, and hopefully that will invite some comments and questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go quickly over the first slide. I realize my button doesn't control that button, so Zach, you have to watch when I hit the button, or I have to say next slide. Everyone knows what the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is. In this room, I don't have to introduce it. I'll give you 10 seconds to read it, and you can ask questions. But that's the baseline. You've already had talks about that, I think, if you've attended the series. But obviously, it's a piece of history now. It's more than 40 years old, and obviously a major transfer of wealth and land. Okay? All right, so why study Alaska Native corporations? It's not something I set out to do. I didn't major in business. I am an anthropologist. We tend to study traditional culture and ways of living and so on. But after living in Alaska for a dozen years and seeing that the role that corporations play in the economy and the culture in really all facets of social life, I began becoming interested in them as institutions. And particularly around the 40th anniversary of ANCSA, there were sort of flurries of anniversary kinds of look-backs at ANCSA and so on. And it seemed to me that this was very interesting, but there needed to be a more formal look into these institutions. And so these are some of the reasons I think they're interesting. The big reason is that they're very unique hybrid institutions. They're not like regular corporations, and obviously they're major cultural institutions as well. One reason is they are ethnic corporations. That's obviously very unusual. A second reason is that they're rooted or place-based. All Alaska Native corporations have land in the state, and unlike the conventional corporations that operate in northern territories, or southern territories for that matter, where they liquidate their assets, including land, when the investments cease to become profitable, you don't have that pattern among Alaska Native corporations. They hold on to their land and see it essentially as part of their ancestral heritage. So that's unusual. Then they're diverse. People tend to think of Alaska Native corporations as sort of a singular entity or set of entities, but they're actually quite diverse. You've got more than 200 in the state. They're geographically diverse, they're culturally diverse. In terms of their investments, they're diverse. In terms of their performance, they're diverse. And so it's always an interesting situation for an anthropologist, I think, to look at an institution that has both created diversity but also has a sort of unitary framework behind it. Because we always want to understand in social science both the diversity and maybe the unity that underlies the diversity. The fourth reason is that they're reciprocating, and it's a very unusual aspect of Alaska Native corporations that they must share their profits amongst each other. And a lot of people don't know about this history, but it was very contentious how this was set up. It took a lot of negotiations and hammering out. But there's a certain sense that everyone has a stake in everyone else's performance. And again, that's unusual, but it does create a network effect. The fifth reason is that they are, in fact, multi-scalar and networked. You have village corporations, you have regional corporations, you have associations and boundary organizations that represent and broker between the various levels of corporate activity. And most of it is contained within the state of Alaska, but it actually goes beyond the state of Alaska. There's representation in Washington, D.C. and other centers of power where these corporations often need to exercise political will and get changes done. And they've had some major successes in that area, so that's interesting. Then they're multi-generational. When you look at the leadership of Alaska Native corporations, along with their own existence, they're now at least 2 generations old. And when you look at an institution, it's always good to have a history to look at, so you understand its evolution and its development. And also the leadership within the corporations is multi-generational. There are board members, in their 20s, maybe even in their teens, I don't know, but certainly in their mid-20s, and there are board members in their late 70s, so a wide range of leadership. Then I think there's a strong ethos of corporate social responsibility and ideals of sustainable development and well-being, and this is something that's reflected almost universally in the mission statements and annual reports of corporations, but probably like all corporations, not every Alaska Native corporation lives up to its ideals and its mission statement, but the fact that they're articulated with a certain set of values is quite interesting, because we're all looking for the right model of sustainable development, if that's not an oxymoron or a non sequitur. If there is a sustainable development, it obviously has to incorporate some key cultural values into it. It can't just be an economic model. And you have a lot of articulation of values within Alaska Native corporation mission statements and other documents, really. And then finally, there's this sort of big question of the tension between what you might call structure and agency, to use the social science terms. But to put it sort of bluntly, did Alaska Natives transform corporations into cultural entities, or did corporations transform Alaska Natives into certain kind of corporate citizens? I'm not less interested in the intent of ANCSA, because it's been called various things, including a sort of Allotment Act Part 2 in terms of dispossessing natives of land. But obviously there has been some creative tension between the impact of the institution on the culture and the impact of the culture on the institution, and trying to understand that dynamic, I think, is very interesting. So there's lots of reasons to study Alaska Native corporations. Next slide, please. Then you find a variety of perspectives on corporations as well. There are the critical studies, such as Judge Thomas Berger's Village Journey, which came early on, was a product of the Alaska Native Review Commission. I know Rosita was on that commission and didn't agree with all of the results, is that fair to say, published in that book. But it was quite critical of the ANCSA model, and he's one who essentially sees it as a kind of continuation of the Allotment Act, and holds up Metlakatla and the kind of reservation system as a better alternative. Then you have a kind of historical perspective with Donald Craig Mitchell's 2 books on the, really the, I would call it a legal historical study of the whole development of ANCSA, and it's an incredibly detailed set of volumes, and I rely on it when I'm looking at history, but it doesn't really tell you anything about what it's all meant in terms of the last 40 years. He's all about telling the story right up until land claims, and then really just has a short appendix about what it's all meant. Then you have a little bit of ethnography in Southeast Alaska, Kirk Dombrowski's book Against Culture, which is quite critical of the role of corporations. He worked in Cake in Hoona and saw a kind of internal colonialism essentially functioning, where a corporate elite becomes the brokers for culture. They create inequality between the wealthier members of society and then the ones who are kind of left out. Personally, I think it's much too simplistic a picture, but it's an interesting perspective. It's a kind of a neo-Marxist perspective, if that means anything to anybody. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. Then you have these kind of celebrations of corporations. This is one from up north, and these are the kind of anniversary books that are published, and they tend to have a theme that's, if not sort of hagiographic, very praiseworthy. It's sort of like, look how far we've come, and maybe isn't quite critical enough in terms of looking at the development of corporations in terms of its analysis. Then you have personal memoirs. These are extremely valuable to me, and I'd like to see more of this genre of literature, Rosita, when you're going to write yours, and Byron and David and some of the others. I think they're extremely valuable, but there aren't very many yet, but they're just starting to come out. And then this one by Jerry Mander is a sort of, ANCSA killed the sacredness of native cultures. Again, it's a fairly simplistic portrait, but one that's quite critical. So that's not everything that's out there, but that's a kind of representative range. Next slide. For me, my interest also stems from my work I've done on subsistence, and I did a lot of research on subsistence patterns, subsistence needs in my early career. And corporations were always the opposite side of subsistence. And the two policies are related in that Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was supposed to provide for so-called subsistence needs, but they punted on that responsibility until ANILCA. And obviously ANILCA was not, in the long run, a very satisfactory follow-up to that promise to take care of subsistence needs. But the two are also kind of paradoxical. You have a sort of subsistence law, and then you have this major new institutions, corporations, which sort of represent the antithesis of subsistence, and yet there they are in Alaska. So I wrote about that in a publication called Sustainability in Communities of Place. And then with Rosita and Deanna Kingston at Oregon State, we put together this this study on Indigenous state relations, focusing on the role of ANCSA and corporations in developing sustainable livelihoods. And so it's really a 3, probably 4-year project now, and we're just collecting the data, so we don't have any final results, but as I said, some themes have come out which I'll touch on. And these are the main purposes of the study, to look at how these institutions, ANCSA corporations, have transformed institutional relations between Alaska Native state governments, ecosystems, regional and global economies, and how they've contributed to groups' well-being. We're focusing on, next slide please, we're focusing on 2 regions, Southeast Alaska and then the Bering Straits region. There were strategic reasons for doing this, but one of them is you can't do it all. A second reason is that both are Regions of cultural integrity, they're both coastal regions, but they have obviously very different habitats. You've got forest here, you've got tundra up north. Both groups have analogs in Canada, so you've got inland Tlinkits that have a whole different set of relations with their state. In Canada, you've got Inuit in Canada as well that have a different land claim settlement process. And so if we ever do a part 2, we want to focus on that, that aspect. Next slide. And in terms of our perspective, I would use this term socio-ecological perspective. What does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. One is that you don't simply measure Alaska Native corporations against a dominant stereotype, such as, are they achieving economic growth or profits, or are they maintaining traditions? Those would be the two extremes. But rather you might look at them in terms of their ability to create sustainable livelihoods and well-being. A second dimension to this is examining both vertical and horizontal linkages between Alaska Native corporations and other institutions and ecological processes, networks, and so on. And then the idea of not looking simply at the institutions themselves, but also how they're being shaped by values, both internal values, extrinsic values, and also what I call, for lack of a better term, the rules of the game. What you can get away with, what you can't get away with, what's difficult, what's easy to do within a corporation structure, if you will. And then another aspect has been trying to see if there are evolving cultural models as Alaska Native corporations mature. Are there evolving cultural models of corporate socio-ecological responsibility in response to these dynamics? Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm going to skip this. But we're taking, essentially using corporate language. Our framework for analysis is what you would call a sustainable livelihoods asset approach. And this involves, maybe dangerously, using economic language, but trying to extend it to include things that are not typically incorporated into economic analysis. So you use words like assets and capital to describe things that people value, but you don't necessarily limit it to economic resources in the narrow sense. So this, what's called the livelihood assets pentagon here, includes these 5 assets. The first one, or the major one, is natural capital, which would be your environment, your land, your resources, your natural resources that you own. And the idea is you've got to relate everything you do back to your sources of natural capital, even if you don't own them. If you are deriving your economic benefit from natural capital, you have to somehow factor that into the equation. Financial capital is, of course, your money and other assets. That's the traditional capital that economists focus on. Physical capital would be things like tools and houses, things like that, infrastructure. Social capital is your relationships, so all of what you might call Tlingit or Haida social organization would be a source of social capital. And then human capital is basically like human resources, the skills, health, ability to work, and so on that you have within your institution. And so that's a quick sketch of it. There's some things that are left out of this, and people have criticized this. One thing is cultural capital, okay? And Sealaska as a corporation, for example, is involved in helping to repatriate objects of great value that are cultural capital. And we all know that these objects can have a tremendous amount of importance within the culture. But how are they accounted for here? So some people would add another point, make it a hexagon, and include cultural capital, and then some people say you need to account for political capital as well, because you can have all this other stuff, but if you don't have any political capital, you may not be able to do what you want in terms of promoting sustainable livelihoods anyway. So that's a quick sketch. Okay, next. Keep going. And in terms of how this works, the idea is that if you take stock of your assets in this broader framework going beyond just financial assets, but including natural capital, social capital, cultural capital, and so on, you think about the broad range of capital and assets you possess, contemplate different strategies and activities that you could use to develop sustainable livelihoods. It will lead to better outcomes, better environmental outcomes, better social outcomes, in short, better human well-being, income, empowerment, health, vulnerability, and so on. And if all that goes well, it gets reinvested into those assets in a sustainable way. So this is, as we say, an ideal. This is not necessarily the way things work, but that's the way it's supposed to work. Okay, next. And then a question that arises out of it is, well, what is natural capital, and what in natural capital is very important to maintain, and then on the other side, what is well-being and what's important to maintain. And this mess is actually a product of a lot of work. It's something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Has anyone ever heard of it? It's a major document in international circles, but it's a real mess to sort out. But it's trying to bring essentially what we know about ecological services, what we need from our natural environment, and connect them to what we want from our social environment. And the whole point is these things have often been disconnected, and by being disconnected, they haven't reinforced each other the way they're supposed to. But what makes it so difficult to read is all of these arrows. But there's also an assumption here, which is easier maybe to contemplate on the ecosystem side. Yeah, we all need food, we all need shelter, we all need water, and so on. But what are the cultural services that we need? What are our ideals of well-being? And are they shared across cultures? And so this sort of takes a lowest common denominator approach to well-being, but arguably this is where diversity is important, because different cultures, different communities may have different ideals of well-being. And the other question that comes up is, what about values? What values are going to drive this relationship? And so one of the things I've been interested in, next slide please, is whether or not there are indigenous models, cultural models of sustainable development that would be better than the messy thing I just showed you, where they're trying to connect ecosystem services to cultural ideals of well-being. And having been around a number of years and seen Sealaska particularly develop its celebration with various themes, it became clear to me that certain things kept coming up in these themes, and they're now becoming rather directly brought out in the corporation's own operations. And to me, this is a sense, at least, of a corporate social provisioning and ecosystem services that were in the last slide. Ha-Shagun would be a lot of sense of people's well-being, and also strength would be maybe more individual. This would be perhaps more social, but obviously the two are related. And then, obviously you've got to balance these things in the middle. So to me, this is a little more elegant than trying to reckon that previous slide where all the arrows were going back and forth to everything, because it's a little more simple, it's a little more parsimonious. But it actually also includes dimensions that are not in the other diagrams, and that's why using the original language and concepts is very important. So something like Ha-Shagun, which is heritage, but it's not really just heritage, it's also destiny in some contexts, is very, very important. And something like a concept like this, one of the big criticisms you get from modern corporations is that they discount the future, and maybe they also discount the past. So if a resource that's inherited from the past isn't useful, you sell it or liquidate it, right? Or if you can make a profit now, you won't